As I record this, I have a fiberglass cloth on my desk. This will be vital for cleaning up all the grease from this game. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mildra, and I will be your gaming monk for the evening. So, Borderlands. Arguably the godfather, or at least one of them, of the looter shooter subgenre we see quite a bit nowadays. Much to the chagrin of some, I'm certain. It's interesting how the series descended into a meme after Borderlands 2. I suppose it's a case of Flanderization, since there always was a degree of tongue-in-cheek humor throughout the series, but that humor grew to overshadow the rest of the game. Anyway, after the release of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, a spin-off that did a high fantasy take on Borderlands with Tina acting as Dungeon Master, I suppose the seeds were planted for an official ttrpg, even if it's based on the spin-off more than the core series. That brings us to Bunkers and Badasses, Nerdvana's take on doing Borderlands in ttrpg form. The results of it are divisive from my cursory glance. Granted, I take some of these takes with a grain of salt because they come from very limited information bases. So, where does B&B stand in the halls of my monastery? Let's find out. Bunkers and Badasses runs at about 272 pages. That said, only half of it really concerns rules, while the other half consists of 3 different scenarios. Scenarios that are written like quick start scenarios for some reason. Anyway, while the book has a mix of straightforward approaches as well as a few flourishes, as if Tina had made some Cliff Note style edits, there's not much issue with the layout. I do have an issue with the text, as I feel it's a bit lighter than it needs to be with that gray background. I don't have a problem with it personally, but I could see some folk having it blend into the background a bit or creating eye strain. Although why a Borderlands game is using so much gray for its background color is beyond me. Character creation is a mix of archetypes, classes, and skills, and we'll be revisiting it with Aldine as we often do here. The first is archetype, which is meant to be the broad category of your character. Each archetype has a starting stat spread between accuracy, your ability to hit, damage, how hard you hit, speed, how much you can move, and mastery, your proficiency with action skills. Regardless of archetype, each has a spread of 0, 4, 2, and 1 in these attributes. Now in our case, we'll go with the Elementalist archetype, and after distributing 3 extra points to attributes, we start with Accuracy 2, Damage 4, Speed 4, and Mastery 4. This means that our ability mods are Accuracy 1, Damage 2, Speed 2, and Mastery 2. This also means we gain an Elementalist feat, which will go with the Quick. As an aside, why is this called a tree in the book? It's a pretty linear advancement setup. You can gain a second archetype at level 5, but I feel that kind of multi-classing falls into old traps from the early 2000s in its execution of separate levels. The second step is class, where you get all the fun stuff you can do. Each class has its associated skill tree, backgrounds, as well as stat increases. In our case, we'll go with Siren, specifically the Lightwalk type, along with the Gunwitch background. This grants us the Phase Walk action skill, which we can use 3 times per day. We also gain 1 skill point, which we will spend on 1 level in Striking. Lastly, the choice of class also grants 2 favored guns. In our case, we'll go with Combat Rifle and Shotgun, and a melee die, in our case a D8. I can't say I'm the biggest fan of the per day restriction on the action skill, but that's the call they made. While character creation is straightforward, I do have a few issues. The lack of a summary page hurts, for one. I don't see why a page dedicated to an overview of the character creation steps couldn't have been done. Additionally, the second page may have been better served as having gun stats instead of the attached cards, and instead of doing the whole background info that they try and do with it. And the card thing is cute, but it's going to create problems to the table who wants to play on a virtual tabletop. I know some people turn up their noses at virtual tabletop, but it is something that needs to be accounted for. Second, I find the setup of archetype and singular class trees to be unnecessarily restrictive. I don't see why there needed to be a separation between archetype and class, and I especially don't see why only 1 tree is available for each class. Not only is this not a thing in the source material, but even other TTRPGs that have some sort of talent tree don't do this. I feel like the intent is to do some sort of mix and match, but I do not agree with the results. In addition, I think the character sheet is another one of those graduates from the single-page school of White Wolf, and this will be a problem at high levels with all the feats and skills you might get, much like with White Wolf sheets. Ultimately, presentation and questionable restrictions hurt. Bunkers and Badasses uses a d20 for its core mechanic. Because that's fairly standard fare, most of the mechanics will be familiar to people, at least by osmosis. It's really where weapon attacks come into play that things veer off the beaten path a bit. See, instead of attacks versus defense, a straight d20 is rolled and compared with a results chart with 3 potential degrees of results. A natural 2 to 7, a natural 8 to 15, and a 16 or higher. This determines how many damage die are roll, as well as crit die, which are always d12. If the gun uses a favored one, you may add your accuracy modifier to the roll, and your damage modifier to the damage total. The damage goes straight to shields and then health. There is a form of extra effort at play with badass moves, which use a special die that reads 1 to 3 and 18 to 20 as 1 and 20 respectively, and no other result is used. This is meant to be used in stunts for actions, and afterwards the GM may grant badass tokens. More on a success, mind you, and a failure also grants a mayhem point that they may use to make things interesting. Now, badass tokens can be spent to add a +1 to a roll on a 1-to-1 basis, and not much else, which I feel is kind of underwhelming. Mayhem points can be used to activate an enemy's mayhem action, but it can also be used to add in a new wave of enemies or grant boss tier enemies an extra action. I know I'm skimming a lot, but when it comes to the core mechanics, it's straightforward, especially for those who have played any d20 based RPG directly or indirectly. While the use of tokens might annoy those who use terms like meta-narrative and role-playing mechanics unironically, as well as the lack of a 5-foot rope, I wanted to note here it's what surrounds the mechanics that's more of a concern, especially since it has to be truncated due to, again, half the book being taken up by modules. When I went through the book, I wanted to test a bit of a theory, so I looked through the creative staff. Most of the writers and designers were from Lettered Games, who mostly have a background in board games, as well as works like Root. Don't get me wrong, I like Root, but I'll get to that in a minute. I'm noticing a pattern between this and the Power Rangers RPG I covered a while back, when it comes to doing ttrpg adaptations, and yet not hiring anyone with a background in developing ttrpgs proper. Power Rangers had devs who worked on modules at most, and Bunkers and Badasses has a lot of board game designers in it. To that end, I think people who give me crap for liking Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition for it feeling too much like a board game owe me a long apology, since at least that game had actual RPG designers working on it. But I digress. Now, some people will look at the D20 in this and their brain rot will kick in. I'm sure some will say it feels like a modified version of insert D&D edition here, because that makes for an easy way to not think. I personally do not see it, but that might be because I don't do surface level. What I see is a game with a couple interesting ideas, but undermined due to a truncated rule set. Again, the actual core book is only 127 pages, some questionable uses of skill trees, and decisions that don't quite mesh with the power fantasy the game clearly wants to go for. I feel like some of the issues I have here would have been alleviated with less modules to give everything else room to breathe, but Bunkers and Badasses feels like a crunch light game that wants to be crunch medium. All that said, I'd give the game a stamp of playable. It's not terrible per se, it's fine, but if someone really wants Borderlands in TTRPG form or just a looter shooter in tabletop form, I feel they'd be better served with the likes of Otherworlds. Yes, I may be biased shilling for one of my friends here, but I feel it has a better understanding of the gameplay loop, and more importantly, not truncating characters for dumb reasons. That and Otherworlds is the same price for the PDF, both about $30. It's just that Otherworlds has a slightly higher page count with 190 pages instead of 127, and isn't stuffing half of that book with modules. It's smart enough to keep any modules separate. I don't have any proof of this, but I do wonder if at some point in the design room there was talk to put more D&D-isms into the design. But I suppose Randy would argue that a real fan would understand what they were doing. Yeah, how could I not bring that up? Stay frosty.